Fantastic. I think everybody's in, and the others will sort of still come in. So just for those of you who's maybe new to Zoom, in the top right-hand corner, there's a button called View, and if you click Speaker View, that's often a better experience. So you can click that, and you're welcome to either keep your camera on or off, as long as you stay muted so that we don't interrupt Deanna. So I'm very excited about today. We're having another gene team, and for those of you new to this as well, so the gene team has been created quite a while ago when we first launched 3x4, and the idea was for those of you who can remember the A-Team, there was a TV show called the A-Team, and the idea was it was a bunch of people who used to go around and do all these rescue missions. So we started the gene team, and the idea was to have deep dives into conversations and always connecting it to genetics for those of you who's either new to it or would like to dive deeper. But I would like to introduce our speaker, Deanna Minich. I'm saying it right, Deanna?
Yes, you are.
And she is actually going to introduce herself. It's always quite nice to introduce yourself. And she's going to talk to us about anti-nutrients, which is a really interesting topic. So I hope you're all going to enjoy it. And we'll come back at the end for questions. You're welcome to start posting your questions in the chat box, and we will then do that at the end. So over to you, Deanna.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Glad to have you all here. I'm recognizing some of the names of some of the attendees. So I'm Deanna Minich, and my background is I'm an educator, nutrition scientist. I have been a clinician. I'm no longer in active clinical practice, and a researcher. And so the area of focus for me and what it has been over these years is phytochemicals. So I don't take a dietary dogmatic approach to the nutrition work that I do. I do focus, however, on what I believe is tried and true, which is that of plants. You know, I think we can arm wrestle protein, we can arm wrestle soy, we can arm wrestle just about anything in the literature. But I would say that the thing that seems pretty compelling would be plants in various formats. So the natural segue from that is that you know, I was asked a number of questions around anti-nutrients, especially with the book that had come out, The Plant Paradox, by goodness, what's his name? Stephen Gundry. It just slipped me for a minute. Dr. Gundry, who I know quite well, actually. And so, you know, I think he started to bring to the forefront this whole aspect of there could be things in plants that people are intolerant of, and not everybody can tolerate all plants. And I think that that's a very plausible message because, I mean, after all, you know, you are all in the space of genetics, and we know that because of individualized constitutions and genetics, we can't actually process things the same way every time by every person. So I take a pretty middle path approach, but I'd like to give you this presentation, hear your questions, and just kind of look at the pros and cons of things that are in plants that can be beneficial, and maybe things that could be problematic for some of your clients. So Annalee, with that, should I just bring up my PowerPoint? Okay. Super. I'm just gonna get rid of all the camera stuff here and just launch right in. Well, you know, I have to say that this topic had come up, I would say, some years ago when Dr. Gundry had presented at the Institute for Functional Medicine Annual International Conference, and he had a whole dedicated talk on autoimmunity and lectins. And, you know, I sat in the audience and I was just reflecting on, you know, wow, this could be a real problem to have these plant foods eaten by people with autoimmune disease and or even perturb the immune system. So what I decided to do was take a deep dive into the literature because, you know, quite honestly, my clinical experience did not show me quite that degree of the inflammatory potential of certain of these plant foods. And I wanted to understand it better. So I'm also, what I didn't mention about my background is that I also teach as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Western States. I teach a graduate level course in the program on functional medicine and human nutrition. And so one of the grad students wanted to do a project with me, and I said, hey, Weston, let's do a deep dive on anti-nutrients, and let's actually do a review article. Let's take a neutral approach. And we titled the article, the title of this presentation, which is there such a thing as anti-nutrients? And in fact, it was picked up by the media, and it did have a lot of hits as a result of kind of a thought-provoking type of title to address this topic of anti-nutrients. And I'm always very sensitive, I would say, to anything that involves the word anti. You know, when I see anti-aging, anti-inflammatory, you know, I often have to reflect on, you know, in nutrition, so often we take a yes or a no approach, a black or a white approach, when I do think that there is some gradation in between, the spectrum, which, you know, a lot of my platform is about the rainbow of different phytonutrients. So I just wanted to give you that long-winded intro because I think it's relevant for where we're going. So these are my disclosures, teaching lots of different things. Well, as I mentioned, there are so many health benefits to eating plants. And so that doesn't mean that I advocate veganism. It doesn't mean that I advocate vegetarianism. I actually think that plants would be a unifying factor amongst many different dietary patterns. So even, you know, omnivores, keto, paleo, you name it. Probably the only one where it would be challenging to connect the dots of plants in would be the carnivore, the straight on carnivore, no plant approach whatsoever. However, even animals are eating plants. So there are still secondary metabolites in that animal flesh. So we cannot separate ourselves from plants. We are surrounded. If we weren't here on this planet, they would take it over. So if you look at the data, and I've been in nutrition now since I was in grad school starting in 1992. So you do the math, you know, just a long time. What we see throughout epidemiological, clinical, in vivo, I mean, whether we're looking at population studies, prospective clinical trials, hands down, what we see is that eating a diet rich in plant foods, whether that is fruits or vegetables, a combination thereof, nuts, seeds, even whole grains and legumes, I'm going to toss those in there, seems to have a benefit for the reduction of risk of a variety of chronic diseases. So there are a number of dietary patterns that do feature eating plants largely. The most well-studied dietary pattern is the Mediterranean diet. So if you just go into PubMed, and I know that all of you know about PubMed, right? I kind of live on PubMed every day. And so when I go into PubMed and I just do a search on all these different dietary approaches, the most well-studied diet is the Mediterranean diet. And the cornerstone of the Mediterranean diet is no processed foods in the way of these refined, nutrient devoid foods, and copious amounts of plant foods and even some animal foods. So, you know, when we look at, well, what has efficacy as a dietary pattern, all of them in some way, even Dr. Mark Hyman's Pegan approach involves plants. So again, I rather than go with emotion, if I'm just looking at the data, I would say that, you know, let's follow the numbers, which would indicate that plants are pretty convincing. So when we look at the dietary guidelines, at least for Americans, I know that this is an international group here, but if I just focus in on America and look at the dietary guidelines, there is also this statement around eating a variety. That's also really key. Eating a variety of nutrient-dense foods, and they do talk about different colors. Dark green, red, and orange vegetables, legumes. Some of you might be familiar with Dr. Terry Walls. She's actually putting on a summit this week that I was just a part of and gave my talk on Monday. She also talks about a lot of sulfur-containing colorful vegetables in conjunction with protein and healthy quality fats, right? So, you know, everybody's kind of talking about color now. Like this is a message that resonates with children, elders, everybody in between, and everybody seems to get it, right? So that's why it came as a shock to me when people started asking me questions about these anti-nutrients being problematic. Now, Americans specifically, and I think that it doesn't differ too broadly if you're looking at Australia or other industrialized countries, what you tend to see is that there are still rising rates of chronic disease. You also see lower intake of fruits and vegetables. So Americans just don't meet even a very basic requirement of fruits and vegetables, unfortunately. And that's really just honing in on fruits and vegetables. When I think of plants, I'm thinking of the spectrum. I'm thinking of spices, herbal teas. As you can see at the far right here, I've got a whole list of different things. And the reason why I think that plants provide a very compelling case is because they contain more than these phytochemicals. You know, when I went to graduate school to study nutrition, there was always talk about, you know, I would call them the three musketeers: protein, carbohydrate, and fat, the macronutrients. There's still a lot of debate, even about things like protein and carbohydrate and fats. I mean, this is like a never-ending debate, right? So then you also have micronutrients like vitamins and minerals, which plants are also a great source of. But what has been further fleshed out, and I did my master's degree on carotenoids, which are just one category of 700 different types of compounds. Some of them convert to vitamin A and some of them don't. But this family of phytonutrients is really getting fleshed out. You know, back in the day, they were just all lumped together into just calling them kind of like the non-nutritive aspects of a plant. Sometimes they were referred to as antioxidants. So they were kind of genericized and not delineated. And I would say that now in the 21st century, where we're at, is we're starting to hear about things like polyphenols. We're hearing about dietary nitrates and NO production, right? We are hearing about organosulfur compounds and detoxification. So there's greater delineation of each of these different categories. It is difficult to understand what we're taking in, though. I mean, even as we start to talk about the anti-nutrients, it's hard to figure out how much we're taking in because they're not quantified. You can't easily find them in databases, and plants are always changing. Their composition depends on where they're grown, you know, obviously the environmental factors, the xenohormesis, and then we have the individual factors. And I want you to remember this because it plays into the anti-nutrient story, is that the individual's physiology, specifically their gut microbiome, can determine what they're doing to those phytochemicals to perhaps make them more efficacious or problematic in the body. So sometimes the phytochemical is a sensor. Think of it as a sensor, that it's not the food that is problematic. It's that perhaps there's something in the food that is triggering a response in the body and perhaps bringing to the surface something that was more or less below the waterline. So I kind of think of anti-nutrients as like messenger molecules, perhaps. So let's entertain that as we continue to go through. So this is just a short list. Of course, you're getting all of these slides, so I'm not going to belabor this particular slide. You know, to say that plants are antioxidants is truly a 1990s message. It's a 20th century message. It's valid, it's true, but it's not really, it's just like when people say melatonin is just for sleep. It tells me that they haven't really explored the research under the hood of things like melatonin or things like plants, because the understanding is quite vast. And we know that it takes on average 17 years to translate the science into clinical practice, right? So there are a lot of different things that these phytochemicals are doing. And you're all very invested in the genetic aspects. So looking at DNA repair, looking at epigenetic modification, there are a lot of things that it's doing, these different phytochemicals are doing at the level of the cell. So one of the things that I did was I also wrote a paper on looking at the science of eating the rainbow and how dietary diversity is important. I think that what happens with a lot of different foods is that, you know, people get into food ruts. And often I'll say to people that they're in food ruts because that's then mirroring life ruts. You know, when we're eating the same thing every day, not getting variety, that can also become problematic, as we all know, from a food intolerance, food sensitivity, and food allergy perspective. So keep in mind that that can also be under the hood of what it might be going on with these anti-nutrients. So my three principles with eating are not to eat like a vegan, eat like paleo, eat a ketogenic diet. It's color, creativity, and diversity every day. So anti-nutrients, you know, you can actually, Weston and I actually made this open access. So you can download, I don't know if Annalee will give you this article, but quite honestly, everything I'm going to showcase in this presentation comes from that article. So we went through lectins, oxalates, phytates, even phytoestrogens, and I'll get into that, and tannins. And we just chunked it out. We just looked at the preclinical data, the clinical data, and then any kind of mitigation factors. Like, let's just stack up the evidence. So yes, the true definition of an anti-nutrient, as it's been referred to classically, like back in animal studies, when high amounts of certain things were fed, like cabbage was fed to rabbits, then there was this goitrogenic effect, right? There was this blocking effect of making thyroid hormones. So there's some kind of a blocking effect with these nutrients. So in a classical sense, the definition of an anti-nutrient as it is circulating out there, they're considered to be compounds in plants which are inhibiting or blocking more nutritive compounds like minerals and vitamins. So they might be blocking them from the standpoint of bioavailability, absorption, receptor activity, and even function. So think a little bit broadly about that. So here's the kind of the takeaway of what are the different anti-nutrients are, what are some of the food sources, and what are some of the clinical implications. If you would just kind of look at, and I think that this is a good go-to slide in terms of just keeping it straight, maybe for clients, and even, and this is in the paper, by the way. So, you can always cross-reference that and bring that forward and talk about it in this way. I'm used to doing the elimination diet with clients in the clinic. That was like my definite go-to program to start with everybody, regardless of what they presented with. Because let's just get rid of like the high allergenic load. But then there would be some cases where certain people would say, hey, Deanna, I already know that I don't do so well with legumes. And so then we would take out legumes. Well, if you look at this list, a number of these different anti-nutrients are found in things like legumes. And we sometimes see that translation into things like an autoimmune type protocol. So just to look to the far right here, the suggested clinical implications. So when we're thinking of what's being said out there around these different compounds, typically with lectins, they're seen as perturbing the guts, causing leaky gut, causing inflammation in the gut. So that's more of an immune inflammatory type of response, more localized to the gut. That's kind of how lectins are seen. Oxalates are more about mineral absorption, which you will see as well with phytates and even tannins. So that in its true sense is connected into that anti-nutrient definition. With oxalates, there's a little bit more talk about kidney stones. We'll talk about that. Phytates kind of flex to being a potent antioxidant, anti-cancer, but then also may inhibit the absorption of certain types of essential minerals. Again, everything is about the dose, the timing. If we can understand a lot of that nuance, a lot of this makes sense. With goitrogens, as I was mentioning before, changes in thyroid function or changes in the production of thyroid hormone because of inhibition of iodine uptake. Phytoestrogens, we could say, well, what are they blocking? We can see that they can block hormones, not, in a good way is how I see it. But it kind of depends on the age of the woman or the man, and the relative amounts of certain things that they have. And there can also be some implications for phytoestrogens, even looking at thyroid. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, tannins. Now, what are tannins though? They're polyphenols, and there's so much good data on tannins. Like, you look at urolithin A, you look at, goodness, so many, you look at the whole host of different types of tannins that are available. They're so important for establishing a good, healthy gut microbiome. But yeah, because they're big and bulky like a fiber, they can get in the way of the absorption of certain things that we'd want to take in. So there are some hacks around that. All right, I kind of did a massive summary there. So I'm going to kind of glide through each one. You're going to have like 5 slides per individual anti-nutrient. So I'm just going to highlight like the major points, what I think is clinically relevant, and you might want to translate more in your clinical practice with patients. So lectins, lectins are ubiquitous. If we're eating any plant food, we're getting lectins, so you can't avoid them entirely. Where they're most problematic is in raw, keyword raw, legumes and whole grains. Now, it's not very common that people just nibble on raw beans, raw whole grains, but if things are undercooked, you will get higher amounts of lectins in those foods potentially. So some of the larger lectin containing foods would be dark and light red kidney beans, pinto beans, black beans, white beans. So yeah, a lot of these legumes. This is why, doing pressure cooking, soaking, adequate cooking of beans, that's important, because that's where we started to see the problem with lectins. There was a case study in which somebody had eaten larger amounts of raw legumes and had some cytotoxicity, had some problems there. So lectins are carbohydrate binding proteins. They're also found in plants, animals, microorganisms. They're not unique to any one species. And higher amounts are found in immature plants. Now, the key thing with a lot of these anti-nutrients and even phytochemicals, just on the whole, is that many times they are produced by the plant by way of surviving in their environment. So as you know, a lot of those secondary metabolites of the plant can be beneficial. Some of them may not be. Right? Some of them may also cause a response in us. And I always find it very relatively amusing, I guess, when I hear that people say, oh, these anti-nutrients are made within the plant to stop you from eating them. As if we were personifying the plant and, kind of giving it that imprint. But it is truly part of their environment response. So if there's a lot of sunlight, high altitude, that plant is going to make different things to enable its best survival, irrespective of the human species. It's just going to do what it needs to survive. So it's very difficult to pin down the amount of lectins and the type for all of these different anti-nutrients, because it's going to be based on the cultivar and where it's grown. So this carbohydrate specificity, these kind of long proteins and carbohydrates, they seem to play a role in many different things. So cell recognition, tissue development, host defense, tumor metastases in both plants and animals. So they kind of, again, have this dual function of, they could be signaling agents or recognition agents. So we need to look at that in the broadest sense. So the thing with lectins where people find the concern is that they can bind reversibly to specific carbohydrate compounds on cells. And what can happen is red blood cell agglutination, right? So as I was mentioning, there have been some cases of food poisoning from ingesting raw or uncooked beans. So, that those have been documented, and those references are in that review paper that we wrote. Some of these lectins can be more resistant to digestion. Think of them kind of like, almost like fiber is resistant to digestion. So whatever's in the gut, whatever's part of the gut microbiome, whatever's feeding on that compound could generate other metabolites. So there can be some issues there. If you imagine that somebody has leaky gut and then they bring in these compounds that aren't easily digested, you can imagine that there could be some kind of disruption at the level of the gut. We don't typically eat like just isolated lectins. So when you look at animal studies where they have used isolated legume lectins, they have seen changes in the gut. So reduced integrity of the intestinal mucosa, altering villus structure, reducing disaccharidase activity, increasing intestinal permeability, and activating the immune system. So it is disruptive to the gut to have high amounts of lectins in isolated proportions. When it comes to clinical data, and this is where I was really interested, was, okay, let's look at where the rubber meets the road. Are there studies looking at autoimmune disease for people who are eating beans, or if they're eating whole grains? But in general, what Weston and I, as we dove into this, did not seem to find that eating cooked beans, there aren't many studies where, people are just setting out to look at people eating raw legumes that probably wouldn't even be ethical, right? Because we know that that's, or even undercooked. But for the amount of data that is out there, the propensity of findings would suggest that beans and whole grains for the average population can be really good. And we could figure out why that would be, you know, all of the minerals, all of the fiber, etc. So it's, again, difficult to find studies in which isolated lectins were given. If people are eating a varied diet, so they're rotating foods every 3 to 4 days, you know, again, small amounts just may not be an issue. Now, what I also thought was interesting, and if any of you were at the Integrative Healthcare Symposium back in February, that was in New York City, there were some interesting comments about looking at lectins in a different way. In fact, there is some interesting in vitro research to suggest that lectins may be important in their role in cancer research. So looking at, you know, are they anti-cancer? Are they anti-proliferative? We don't know. We actually don't know. The human data is lacking, but all of which to say that perhaps, you know, we call something very quickly an anti-nutrient, but then later we learn that, oh, wow, it's got other applications. It isn't actually anti, it's just that within the certain environment it's in, it flexes to different functions. So if you want to reduce lectins, you cook food. You cook food well. You soak. You know, high pressure cooking, autoclaving, boiling. Usually moist, hot methods of heat. So a slow, low, moist method of cooking. So cooking beans over time in a slow cooker would be definitely optimal. You're going to be reducing the lectins in those foods significantly. Microwaving is not effective. Fermentation, so allowing things to soak, ferment, and then cook would be your best case scenario. So again, there are different hacks and ways to kind of overturn and reduce the amount in these potential foods. So the takeaways here clinically would be prepare foods properly, right? And you know, if we just look at clinical data, it's really challenging to find human trials that lectin-rich legumes can cause inflammation, but you know, there can be personalized responses. I don't negate that. And everybody, you know, just after seeing people in clinic, you could see how some people are just not well primed from their gut or from their immune system perspective to handle certain foods. So it's entirely plausible. But rather than looked at lectins overall, it might just be getting the gut health reestablished and looking at specific foods and those actions and reactions. I do think that there's a great study by Dr. Vajdani, and you probably all know him. He's an immunologist. He just won the Linus Pauling Award at the IFM meeting. And he had this excellent paper, which is listed here at the bottom. You can go and get it yourself and read further. But he basically found that anti-lectin antibodies were displayed in individuals with a range of 7.8 to 18% immunoreactivity against different lectins. That means that when you take isolated blood from people and then you test against anti-lectin antibodies, there can be some type of cellular response. Now, again, that's not within the entire systemic approach, but there can be some kind of cellular immunoreactivity. So, but you'll see in the paper that he talks about how that doesn't mean that we should be dismissive of everybody not eating these particular foods. Again, we have to take a more individualized approach. We also need to look at all the other things that are in those kinds of foods. So lectin-rich foods will contain other anti-inflammatory compounds. All right, so I need to move a little bit faster here. Oxalates, the definition of oxalates is that these two are compounds formed in plants, oftentimes based in response to their environmental signals. So in plants are used for calcium regulation, protection, detoxification. It can be a metabolite of ascorbate, glycoxylate, hydroxyproline, glycine. So for people with taking in things like collagen or vitamin C, we want to be thinking about oxalates if they were oxalate sensitive. In plants, it can present as either water soluble or insoluble salts. And it's the soluble oxalates that tend to be most concerning due to the more ready uptake in the gut. Now, if something is soluble, then you would think, okay, well, then I just need to cook it in water with heat in order to remove those potential soluble oxalates. So that is something to be thinking about there. There are certain people, you know, I don't know if you probably know this, that there's an oxalobiome. So certain people just have a gut microbiome that can help to degrade oxalates. So, and then you also have people who are hyper absorbers of these oxalates. So they can hyper absorb like 10 to 15% greater amounts of these oxalates, where they do become problematic for that individual. So I'll get into that. So some of the foods with high oxalates: spinach, chard, amaranth, taro. Every time I post something on social media with spinach, people are like, they jump all over me for the oxalates. It's so funny. You know, there's just this charge around oxalates specifically. I find that even more than lectins. So smaller amounts are here. Leaves have the greater concentration compared with the stalks. And when you look at conventional and organically grown, doesn't seem to be a lot of difference. You don't tend to find that research for each of the different anti-nutrients, but you would think plausibly that if an animal, if a plant is more stressed in its environment, like you have with organically grown food, you might tend to have more of these anti-nutrients because they are part of the secondary metabolite defense response. So that's the potential, but that has not been codified in the literature. So what can happen is that when these oxalates, so oxalic acid, gets together with certain things like minerals, it can form complexes, and it's thought to contribute to things like calcium containing stones. So there have been different studies where they look at the amounts of oxalates taken in, and you know, what are the thresholds, right, in terms of the amount from the diet. So total dietary oxalate intake is only in the range of 50 to 200 milligrams. But some people, let's imagine that they are vegan, they're doing a lot of greens, and they're having raw, you know, like raw spinach smoothies every day, like 12 ounces, you know, that could be higher. So, you know, sometimes we're eating foods out of the norm that they have been eaten in. So again, shaking up the routine, getting that diversity. So dietary oxalate may contribute up to 50% of the total urinary oxalate excretions. So it can have a significant contribution to the whole. And as I mentioned, some people just hyper absorb. So when Weston and I looked at the clinical data, there was one study that I found probably most compelling, and that was the large nurses' health study, which found a modest association between dietary oxalate and kidney stone formation. This was a prospective analysis. So what they found was that those in the highest quintile of taking in dietary oxalates compared to the lowest quintile had a relative risk of just a 22% greater intake versus the group that wasn't taking in as much. And that men with lower calcium intakes had a relative risk of 1.46. So what that means is that there was actually a, that the mineral intake could modify the effect of the oxalates. So in the absence of adequate calcium intake, there can be some changes. So the idea here is that perhaps we need more minerals, that perhaps oxalates are signaling that we need to have more minerals in the diet, or at least that we need our minerals together when we're taking in those oxalate containing foods. And typically, many of those greens do also inherently contain the minerals. So some of the contributors to stone formation, you know, it's vast. It's not just oxalates, right? We have to consider looking at protein intake. We need to look at phytate, other types of minerals. We need to look at the health of the bowel, just bowel disorders, the gastrointestinal tract, looking at leaky gut. Because again, if somebody, and there's a way to test for the oxalobiome, right? I know that there's one lab in particular that actually looks at that. So how do you reduce oxalates? Because they're soluble in water, and because you're more concerned about the soluble oxalates, if you are concerned, boiling and steaming would be best. So boiling those vegetables, and I know that that doesn't sound, it's almost like, I thought we didn't want to lose a lot of those nutrients. And you will lose certain nutrients when you use water-based methods, right? You're going to be losing things like water-soluble vitamins like vitamin C, but you will be enhancing some other vitamins like the provitamin A type of carotenoids, right? Which tend to be more fat soluble and more resistant. So if a vegetable has a lesser exposed surface, losses may be less, but soaking overnight, boiling, autoclaving all help to reduce oxalates in legumes. So typically what can be important is to pair high oxalate foods with high calcium foods to help offset soluble oxalates and just cook the food well, right? So keeping mineral intake sufficient and testing for that. Test for magnesium, test for calcium, test for potassium. These are all very critical. And even zinc, test for selenium, all of those divalent cations, anything that's a +2, you want to be testing for, even iron. All of those are essential. So there is individuality here because of the gut microbiome, because of different kidney types of health issues that need to be considered. We also need to look at food prep. Now, already just from hearing me talk about lectins and oxalates, it's almost like we can get at both of them just through the same cooking method. So you're going to see a trend here, right? So again, looking at the whole of the diet and those minerals. When it comes to phytates, what are phytates? They're known as phytic acid, myo-inositol hexaphosphate. Sometimes you'll see it as that. It's a storage form of energy in the plant, and it's also seen as an antioxidant. So you're going to find phytates typically in foods that track with higher fiber. So grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, and again, much like oxalates and much like lectins, they can vary with growing methods, the time of the season, the year, the cultivar, and processing grains will have less phytate, and it also has, they would have less fiber, right? So again, just be thinking of it like that. So the phytate can act as a strong chelator. Now that might be a good thing in certain cases, right? When we think of chelation, at least when I'm lecturing on metabolic detoxification, that can actually be a great thing because you can chelate a lot of those divalent heavy metals. So we're looking at mercury, cadmium, arsenic, lead, all those +2, right? So in certain cases, it might be kind of nice to have that chelating property. But there is the other side, which is anything that chelates can bind to not just the heavy metals, but also to the divalent cations that are essential minerals. So copper, calcium, zinc, and iron. So if somebody, like, let's just say, even in certain parts of Africa, where it is kind of a mono grain kind of way of eating, what you can see, and that's what I have seen in some of these studies, is that when you have those foods at high amounts all the time, you can start to see things like zinc deficiency. So because of the decreased mineral bioavailability, especially in diets that are not very diverse, right? So, and there are some different factors that depend on that can contribute to that chelation effect. When it comes to clinical data, when you look at you know, just the intake of phytate, it's estimated at between 2 to 2.6 grams. Mixed diets may be as low as 650 milligrams. There are some studies that support the finding that phytate reduces zinc bioavailability. So, and zinc is, you know, again, you want to have that measured in your clients. I think that that's a good indicator, and you want to keep that zinc to copper ratio, looking at zinc to other minerals as well. That's important. So a lot of these studies are incredibly variable. And in several of the studies, what I was noticing is that they're more specific to certain populations, like in children, and you just find mixed results. So I think that that could be due to the overall dietary pattern, to the population studied, to the relative amounts of other things like zinc in the diet. So when you do have a vegetarian that you're working with or a vegan, you may need to be thinking about essential minerals to ensure that they are getting adequate amounts. Having additional ascorbic acid may be helpful because of keeping those minerals in a state that would facilitate absorption. So yeah, in theory, high phytate foods could be used therapeutically for binding excess cations like iron or even heavy metals, as I've been alluding to. So there are certain even supplemental products where they focus on phytates for that particular reason. So when it comes to looking at reducing phytates. So the same methods as we were just talking about for the other compounds, right? Soaking, fermenting, sprouting, germinating, and cooking. So again, making sure that we're cooking those chickpeas, those lentils, those beans well. And, you know, soaking can reduce that phytate, but keep in mind that you can also be reducing the minerals. It's interesting, right? How it's like everything, there's a ripple through effect. So even if you're reducing one thing, you might be reducing other things that could be beneficial. Germination and fermentation, I think in general, tend to be beneficial practices for food preparation because you can reduce some of the compounds, the undesirable compounds, but yet preserve or even enhance others. So that's something to think about. There also is some indication that adding Lactobacillus plantarum 299b can help to reduce phytates. So if you are fermenting foods, that may help to reduce some of the phytate that would help with iron absorption from a meal. All right, so with takeaways, so much like the other anti-nutrients, phytates have varying uses. They may reduce the bioavailability of essential minerals, yet also act as a potent antioxidant. So again, there are two sides to phytates. And again, it's about how we can best cook our foods, right, and consume it. So goitrogens. Goitrogens refer broadly to anything that interferes with thyroid function and increasing the risk of goiter. So this could mean not only things that are in plants, but also that could apply to medications, environmental toxins. Now, this is really interesting, right? Because some of these proposed goitrogenic compounds are also really healthy compounds for detoxification. Case in point, I'm thinking of the glucosinolates. So this is a class of more than 120, I think it's up to like 130 compounds, primarily in the brassica family. So we think of cruciferous vegetables, you think of broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts. And, you know, you see a lot of variability, but basically when you take these foods and you disrupt the cell wall matrix, you get the leaking of the enzyme myrosinase that converts glucosinolates to other healthy compounds. So some of these compounds you want, some of them you don't want. Some of them are incredible, like sulforaphane for enhancing metabolic detoxification and other things. And then other of those compounds may have more of a goitrogenic effect. So some of the, as I'm alluding to here, some of those breakdown products may have effects on thyroid by reducing the uptake of iodine. So some of those compounds would be, in fact, one of them is called goitrin and the other one thiocyanate. Now, when you're breaking these things down from food, they're kind of rippling through and you get a number of them. You can have several different of these metabolites. So it's not like you're just taking in high amounts of that, unless of course, you know, this is all you're eating and that your iodine level is low. You want to ensure that the thyroid is functioning well by having adequate iodine and selenium, and that iodine and selenium are in good, healthy balance. So yeah, there have been some effects seen on thyroid health. And when you look at things like feeding cabbage to rabbits or having a high glucosinolate diet, you can see some of those initial effects on things like iodine uptake. So that's why assessing for things like iodine deficiency or insufficiency, and then looking at the intake of certain foods that would tend to contain some of these goitrogenic compounds would be important. When it comes to human clinical data, there isn't a lot of data to suggest that having a high cabbage diet, although, you know, how many studies would actually be looking at that, right? So we have to keep that in the back of our mind that it's not necessarily something that would be commonly explored. There is some epidemiological evidence between high goitrogenic foods and thyroid dysfunction, and that is seen in the context of low iodine intake. Some people will be more susceptible to this. I do think that this is something to be, and especially because so many people are starting to do high amounts of cruciferous vegetables in formats that don't involve proper cooking, again, like juicing and a lot of raw. And I don't think that our bodies are built for all that raw all the time throughout the year. So there is some mixed data. And in fact, some associations between frequent consumption of cruciferous vegetables and higher risk of thyroid cancer. Other studies indicate an inverse relationship between those vegetables in the diet and thyroid cancer. So it's kind of mixed. And I think it has to do with, again, the amount, the other lifestyle factors, the other foods that are taken in, how the food is prepared, and certain gene variants, right? I'm speaking to you that I think what is missing in so many clinical trials is looking at the individualization of the population through their genes. Those on diets with soy isoflavones do not seem to substantially impact thyroid function. So that sometimes comes up. Does soy get in the way of thyroid function? You know, you have to be, again, consuming excessive amounts of certain foods, but in certain cases where people are just having processed soy all the time, yeah, I would be thinking about making sure that their thyroid is working properly. And other things, you know, they're looking at their gut microbiome. So cooking and fermenting may lower glucosinolate concentrations. So steaming broccoli for 5 minutes reduce glucoraphanin and total glucosinolate content. So cooking can reduce the potential goitrogens, but also reduce the potential beneficial glucosinolates that could be important for detoxification. You know, one of the things that sticks in my mind from, I think it was 2010, going to the IFM AIC, listening to Dr. Johanna Lampe talk about, you know, it was all about cancer. And we were talking, you know, there were different sessions. She was talking about her work on cruciferous vegetables. And her, and again, this is just from my memory, this is not from a study, but I just remember her saying to steam broccoli like 1 minute and 30 seconds. You know, like when broccoli gets that bright green, it's almost like that potentiates its benefit for detoxification. Perhaps it's more of the Goldilocks, where it's not too much cooking, where you lose the benefit, and not too little, where you get more of the excess goitrogenic compounds, and you get just right. But the science on that is still relatively unsophisticated. So there is definitely conflicting results. You just have to know that as practitioners, you're going to have to reevaluate that. And fortunately, thyroid health is pretty easy to assess. You know, looking at autoimmune measures, looking at iodine, looking at selenium, looking at, you know, TSH, T3, T4, reverse T3, looking at all of those, you can get a good handle on how somebody's thyroid hormone is vis-a-vis their diet. So if iodine is low, that could potentiate some negative impacts. And it can also potentiate issues with autoimmune conditions with the thyroid too. So, you know, again, cooking, it seems to be the takeaway here. And I know that I'm at time in terms of trying to reserve some time for questions, and I'm able to stay over 5 minutes if people would like to stay on, but I can whip through this. Phytoestrogens, most of you know what phytoestrogens are. They're plant-based estrogens. They kind of look like estradiol. They bind to certain receptors. Primarily, they bind to more of the, I would call it the cell protective type of estrogen receptor, ER beta. And you know what's interesting is like all this talk about polyphenols, excuse me, all this talk about polyphenols, if you start to whittle it down and start to define what those are, phytoestrogens are polyphenols, meaning that even something like resveratrol is a phytoestrogen. So I think sometimes certain words scare people, like, oh my gosh, phytoestrogen, you know, man boobs, or, you know, oh my gosh, should I be having that? Or, you know, what is that going to do to my estrogen? But actually, so much of the phytoestrogenic effects of these compounds can arise based on the gut microbiome interaction with them. So isoflavones, you know, typically we think of soy when we think of phytoestrogens, but it's so much more than soy. I mean, you're eating plant hormones with every meal. There's no doubt about it. Just certain amounts of plants have a little bit higher amounts. You know, soy usually gets maligned for that reason, but actually flax has significant amounts of lignans, and lignans are phytoestrogenic, right? And so there's an even greater effect there. Still beans like the resveratrol, coumestrol. So again, a lot of research and a lot of batting back and forth. And I think that there is a lot of nuance. Don't have poor quality soy. I have soy foods in my diet. I rotate them in. I have tempeh. Sometimes I do have organic tofu. It's all about that gut microbiome. And if your gut microbiome can take those isoflavones and transform them into things like equal, that could be really good for things like bone and skin. So equal is one of the most well-studied isoflavone metabolites. Most people in Western populations can't convert to the same degree that people in Asia can. So there are different microbiome populations in which there's just, and you could say, well, chicken or the egg, is it because they eat more soy, so then their gut microbiome adjusts? I don't think we know the answer of that. But we could surmise that probably more regular intake could start to prime the gut into producing more of that beneficial equal. In terms of benefits, mixed results for hot flashes. A food source is going to be different than a supplement source. And, I do think about having soy very early on. What else is in soy-based products, which tend to have higher amounts of things like environmental contaminants. And I think about that with dairy as well. I think about it with every food. We live on a planet that isn't really in a state of balance right now. So just what else are we taking in? When it comes to thyroid function, sometimes there's been some concern around that, and hence the connection to the anti-nutrient conversation, right? There isn't a lot of clinical data to support that, especially again, if you've got your thyroid in good check, iodine is good, selenium is good. And the other question is, well, what about somebody that has had estrogen sensitive malignant growth? The takeaway there is that it's kind of a mixed bag. The data are very select to the Asian population, which is why we need to be looking genetically at things like hydroxylase type of cytochrome P450 enzymes, right? We know that the hormone cancer story is much more vast than just eating soy. It's what our body is doing to certain compounds. It's how we're hydroxylating, how we're methylating, how much glutathione we have. And that's why the gene variants are so important for understanding the nuance of whether or not somebody needs to be eating certain foods. Clinical data, there's some good findings. I just kind of summarized that already verbally for you. Dietary sources, again, the Asian diet has more than the typical Western diet. And again, I'm always in favor of food sources over supplement sources for something like this when it's an unknown for an individual. Cooking and processing, and again, boiling and steaming can change things within soy food. Fermentation can also change things, making those isoflavones more bioavailable. So I think I'm assuming that your takeaway here is the same as mine, which is a little bit of cooking can do a food quite good, especially when it's a complex plant food and somebody is coming in from the place of not having very good gut health, has immune issues, has inflammation, right? Maybe they have leaky gut. And then we'll just close with tannins quickly. And again, tannins are big and bulky. They're all pervasive throughout the plant food kingdom. They're what make a cup of tea astringent and make you pucker, right? So, they're part of the plant defense framework. They are antioxidants, they're anti-cancer, they're immunomodulatory, they're detoxifying because they can bind things. And there are different kinds of tannins. You've got some that are relatively small, and then you have some along that trajectory that are big and bulky, like the ones from pomegranate, right? Elagitannins. You probably have heard a lot about those. And people are now going on with things like pomegranate elagitannins to identify certain metabolites like urolithin A that seem to confer benefit for metabolic health. So that's why we can't just say, oh, tannins, all bad, because it's really about, again, how we're using them and what we're taking them in as. So tannins, as you can see, they're in a lot of great foods, right? Tea, like some of the longest living cultures on the planet eat these foods. So we can't say that it's just that tannin containing foods are bad. In fact, some of these are very potent protective foods as I scan this list, right? A lot of good, healthy foods for the gut microbiome. So you tend to see nuts, beans, darker beans, different teas, even red wine. Nut, like walnuts would be a great source of elagitannins, much like pomegranate. The concerns would be that, yeah, because they're big and bulky and in isolated amounts in a non-diverse diet, what you can see is that they can start to chelate not only heavy metals, but also essential minerals. So in countries where they're having a lot of, I would say, high tannin products, a lot of things like millet, or, they're just having the same foods over and over again, drinking a lot of tea, it's thought that the tannins in those foods might be contributing to iron deficiency anemia. But some studies find that iron absorption is not impacted and may be variable. That makes sense, right? Because the diet is so diverse. There have been other clinical studies in which they looked at tannin supplementation. I mean, if you're taking any kind of these like green tea or EGCG, you are getting in these tannins, right? So if you have concerns about iron, you want to take it away from when you would have a meal that would contain iron. There, in general, are just really mixed results here. And again, there are so many variables to account for. And if people are concerned, consuming something like a cup of tea about an hour after a meal, just to ensure that you're not having that kind of reduced or inhibited iron absorption. And there was a study on that. By the way, you have all of these references in the paper. They're all listed there with all of these different tidbits. So somebody's iron status could influence the effect of tannins. Looking specifically on menstruating women, I think we do need to look at those women who are actually losing blood, losing iron. Are they having just a non-diverse diet, high plants? Maybe this would be something to be looking at. And there could be strategies where you just have those high tannin containing foods away from the iron-rich meal. We know that vitamin C enhances the uptake of iron. But there are a number of different health benefits from taking in tannin containing foods, right? So, and again, I've just been alluding to those. They're listed here on the slide. You can help to reduce some of the tannins in foods by sometimes with cooking them or removing the skins, although with removing the skins, you also remove a lot of the different phytochemicals. You do see that the catechin content or the tannin content of tea increases with increased infusion time. As it becomes more bitter, more astringent, you can think of that as an indicator for tannins. So the takeaways would be, just have those high tannin foods, have that cup of cocoa away from an iron containing meal if there is concern. So here's kind of the shortcut of everything that I just talked about. So this is your cheat sheet. And actually, Annalie has something for you on this where it's kind of like the 3x4 version of it. So what increases that anti-nutrient? You know what? I have flip-flopped this. So let's correct this. What decreases are these things. That's an error here. And what increases would be these things on the right. So please make note of that. That's really big. I made a bit of a blip there, so I'll have to change that on my slides. All right, so just to close, scientific limitations. There aren't a number of clinical trials in which we look at isolated amounts of these anti-nutrients. There are so many different aspects and the context of a person's overall dietary pattern that we have to look at. Many times in even food frequency questionnaires, we don't see questions about cooking, fermenting, processing, soaking. Did you have that food seasonally? Where did you get that food from? There are so many other questions to be asking, right? So what I would say is that we need to take an individualized, personalized view. We need to be looking at diversity of the diet, bioindividuality, looking at one's gut microbiome, especially with things like soy and oxalates. We need to be looking at the gene variants and the amount of consumption. And I'm just going to leave you with one final thing to ponder. This is more of a philosophical standpoint, but if we look at what is in plants and what it truly disrupts human physiology and truly disrupts things like minerals and takes a lot of our nutrient resources, I would contend that our focus needs to be on toxic load, toxicants, true toxicants in the way of human-made toxins. You know, I don't want us to be thinking so much about, I mean, anti-nutrients and plants that naturally occur are one thing, but when we have a lot of these, you know, industrialized compounds that truly disrupt the gut microbiome, they negatively change the immune function, hormones, they're endocrine disruptors. This is what I think we need to be focused on. So I want to thank you. Sorry, I went a bit over there, Annalee.
Fast time went actually. So I'm hoping, so for those of you who have to jump off, we are recording this so you can listen to the recording later. I have a very, for those of you who come to these often, you know that we always have a tool, so I don't want to disappoint. So I'm going to quickly show you the tool and then we'll get to questions. There were a few, but I think quite a few of those you've answered already. So as you know, so when you do your genetic test and you get all the information, and we obviously always put food first, and we do sometimes recommend supplements. What we've done is we've taken we've adapted this from Deanna's tool and from her article. So you'll see here, you can also go to her website to find this. But what we did is we just went a step further to just help you summarize what you would look at, what pathways you would just think about specific of some of these anti-nutrients. So you'll see on this side, we had sort of the positive aspects that we try to summarize like you've done. I hope we've done it justice, Deanna. So just what would be positive. And what's also interesting is phytates and tannins. Also, if you have iron overload, which is a genetic SNPs where you have hemochromatosis, that could also be used in a beneficial way. Yes, so we've just listed it here for you, and the potential negative impact, but really on the side here, a lot about the way you can process it. So I'm not going to go through this. I want you to look at it. It will be on our community and you'll be able to look at it. Hopefully you can look through that. I think what we'll do is we'll go back. I'll stop my share and we'll quickly answer some of the questions. Okay, so there were some questions about the processing, which you've answered, the sprouting. So there was a question, obviously, if you're sprouting, you don't have to cook as well.
Well, quite honestly, there aren't studies where they kind of, or at least I haven't seen the studies in which they look at sprouting versus cooking. I think it is better ultimately if you have some degree of cooking because it inactivates things. So sprouting is good and you can inactivate certain enzymes, but if you further want to get rid of things, some degree of heat needs to be applied, was my takeaway.
Okay, so nice.
That's my takeaway.
Sprouts.
Yeah. Or at least, you know, probably the amount of sprouted legumes that people are having are not in huge quantities either. So, you know, just keep it in mind, like, don't think in absolutes, think in a spectrum, like how much of these things are people truly having?
Exactly. Then there was a question, thoughts about soaked and sprouted grains. It's like brown rice, which you recommend soaking after, so it's already soaked, which you soak it some more prior to cooking.
Yes, I would. And in fact, I would do that more for the toxins. There's a great article in which they showed, and even in India, they kind of do this as a matter of course in households, right? Where you take rice and you put it in water, even after it's been, you know, soaked. That would be nice. You put it in water, you cook it for a bit, like 5 minutes, then you pour off that water, you replenish the water and you finish off the cooking. You get rid of the arsenic in rice. That was that goal of doing that. But when it comes to rice, I like the idea of soaking, and even if it is sprouted in some way, I think, especially with rice, I would soak, kind of go through that process, because even in the literature, 2 rounds of soaking, or at least, you know, having the water, the heat, pouring it off, replenishing, led to less arsenic. So not only are you reducing what we would call anti-nutrients, but potentially other contaminants that could be in the rice.
Okay, that's very good tip.
Yeah.
And then how about oxalate and alkalization?
That's a good question. And I don't actually know the answer to that. And I don't know in what context, right? Because alkalinization, I mean, if we think of minerals creating more of an alkaline milieu, we would say that yes, potentially that would help with the improvement and create the binding so that those oxalates aren't absorbed. But to what degree, I don't think we know.
Yeah, I know Teresa asked this question. She's does a lot of work around oxalates, so I know why she asked it.
Oh, good, good. Yeah.
And the most accurate methodology to test iodine levels?
Some people say urine. You can also do red blood cell levels. You know, they give you different kinds of information, but I think getting a gauge on red blood cell levels of iodine, selenium might be kind of nice just to compare the two as far as like systemically what's circulating rather than looking at metabolites only in the urine.
Exactly. Okay. And then will taking sulforaphane supplement also cause thyroid disruption?
I'm not aware of any studies that would suggest that. That is not one of the goitrogenic compounds that come from the glucosinolates. So I think you're in the clear there. And there are so many benefits of sulforaphane.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have goitrogens in broccoli microgreens?
You probably do. Yeah. The question is, you know, how much and how much of the broccoli microgreens is one consuming? Typically those aren't cooked. So I would say, you know, there is some potential there. It's just unknown how much because it's a natural product and it's grown differently, right? But yeah, I think that there could be some goitrogenic compounds there just based on what we know about glucosinolates.
Okay, and then when it comes to teas, which is better, tea bag versus loose leaf organic?
Definitely loose leaf. You know, we know that the tea bags have issues, right? So either they have plastic. I mean, why heat something that's not natural into your cup of water? So I prefer a loose leaf or a very good, you know, I worked in the tea industry, so I got to know a little bit about this. I mean, you could have gluten in tea bags. You could have it on the string, you know, those pillow packs with like the adhesives around. So it's like, what are you dissolving into your hot water? You know, I mean, so definitely loose leaf and definitely organic, hands down.
Yes. And then I think you've maybe answered this. Would you recommend soaking grains and nuts with a higher tannin? Yes. Okay, that's all the questions. I remember I was thinking about a patient I once saw who had was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and it was getting so much worse. And then when I took his diet history, he'd been taking literally cups full, I think 3 cups a day of kale. And he made this green smoothie of this with all this kale, which he got this idea. And when we tested his thyroid, it was yeah, he was so hypo, and I guess his doctor took a history and said, oh, you're eating all these greens, fantastic, but didn't ask what greens and how he's doing it. So that was yeah. And so
all he needed to do was to steam or cook that kale before it went in the smoothie, right? Because there's a kind of a whole thing about that, right? If you're going to have a green smoothie, cook the greens first. You know, it's just not normal. We haven't seen that long term throughout our lineage, right? So any new fad or trend in nutrition, we always have to question, how is that different than how we've been using that food? What are the implications of that? So that's why I'm very skeptical about, like, you know, the celery juice craze, the kale juice craze. You know, high amounts of things repeatedly, that just feels like excess. So it's just something to look at. It could be good for some people. I'm not discounting that it could have benefit as well.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that was so interesting. I must say, we all think about plants differently after today, I'm sure. And going through all that information about phytonutrients, I know it's so much one can actually talk about when we talk about phytonutrients, but this was very, very interesting because I know there's a lot of misconceptions out there. So thank you so much. It was so amazing to have you because
great to be here.
We know you're very, very busy. So thank you for making time. And as we said, we will post this, and we always carry on with questions on community, and hopefully we can get you there as well. And if there's anything interesting or difficult for us to answer, I'm going to rope you in.
Sounds great. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.